Winter Latina show.
Hosted by IDM.
You know what that means?
It's like we are live in the middle of a chat between us.
In the middle of a chat.
How are you doing, Nina? I see people on the chat already. Who cares? It's on the chat.
Who cares is in the person, not that you don't care. We always have to point this out. Hi, who cares?
And I love to do that.
I am doing well. However, I do have to warn you guys that I sound congested thanks to likely my open water swimming, because who doesn't like swimming in 13 degrees Celsius / 55 degree Fahrenheit water? I mean, I know I do. So this is why I sound congested. So this is what you might be hearing. But welcome to another installment of the Winter Latina show. And today, by popular demand, we have Alex Krainer, the market expert, political commentator, back on the show. We had him very recently. We've received a lot of questions. We've received them on YouTube. I've received them privately. I just posted this on Telegram. And I, received yet another question. So obviously, we decided to invite him back because his expertise is really invaluable. For those who missed the first episode, it's linked. But let me introduce Alex again. He is the founder of Krainer Analytics and the creator and publisher of iSystem Trend Compass reports. He combines his academic background and experience as a market analyst, trader, researcher, and hedge fund manager. He's been in this field since the 1990s, so he is a wealth of information. Marcelo, let's bring Alex back on.
Let's bring him on. And wait. I messed up. I guess, I shouldn't be doing this anymore. Okay, everybody's on the screen now. How are you doing, Alex? I'm sorry.
Everybody's on the screen. Hi,
Doing
Alex.
very well. Hello, good to be with you again, and greetings to all.
Well, thank you for coming back on such short notice. You're obviously in demand. And I saw that you recently updated your iSystem Trend website, right? I just saw that you posted it again. So
I updated a few pages, but just because.
Well, you should be inviting people, saying it's brand new information that no one's ever seen before. Come to my website now, or you'll miss out. It's a limited opportunity. Come on, Alex. You've been in the business.
And remember to like, share, subscribe.
I'm the world's worst salesman.
And
that's why you make money.
And nonetheless, people want you back on this episode. So in the previous installment, in our first conversation, we had a really broad discussion, right? We talked about politics. We talked about London, presumably being the center of the world politically and financially. And at the end of the show, which was quite long, we got into the topic of money. So just as a reminder for those who might have missed it, we talked about very briefly that USD is a global reserve currency, or at least it was. It might be losing this status. We talked about the reasons why this might be happening. And we also talked about the emergence of BRICS in this particular context. We talked about BRICS politically as well. So we sort of briefly touched upon the subject of Bitcoin and gold and what the future unit of trading might be, the way governments use money. But it was very, very brief, because we by then had been talking for, I think, 2 hours. So I think today we want to focus on this topic, but we also want to start broad. Now, Alex, I don't want to have you talking about the history of currencies and money and precious metals from the time people used barter, although that would be very interesting. That might be a multi-part installment, but it would be interesting to situate this question kind of in broader political terms. So, for instance, we can talk about the way governments use gold, and you talked about the limits of using precious metals in this way. We can talk about the way USD became the global reserve currency in the first place, maybe, in the middle, going out of the middle of the 20th century. So why don't we start there, and then we'll sort of narrow down the topics, and we'll also read out some of the comments to address the questions that we've received. How does that sound?
That sounds excellent, but if I may, I have a better idea.
Okay.
I'd like to go back to the beginnings of money, and if you study the beginnings of money, it's already complicated. And if you get to the modern age, even even if you go back to 500 years ago, it's already complicated. And the bankers like to keep it complicated. There was a moment when Alan Greenspan was. I think it was a Senate testimony or something like this back in the 1980s. I think it was in 1980. I don't know, 8, 9, whatever. I don't remember the year. But basically, he said to his audience, "If what I'm saying seems clear to you, you're probably misunderstanding me." So everything about the way money is treated in the domain of economics, and I don't know what other domain deals with money, is already at a level of complexity that you're dealing with Gordian knots. And so, which way do you pull? How do you untangle it? And I promise you, what I'm about to share with you took me about a lifetime to work out, because I've always been asking myself, what is this? What is it? Like, how come this person agrees to cut my hair for this piece of paper? What is it? Where's it coming from? What does it represent? And, the textbooks, especially the ideology, is not helpful, because, you have the Keynesians, you have the monetarists, you have the Austrians who, have very, very strong convictions about everything, but you still don't get close to the money being intuitive so that a 4-year-old can understand it. And this is the kind of understanding I've been after. Okay, so let's go back to where we were living in small nomadic tribes, or simple social units, and we didn't use any money. And if you look at nomads, they travel around the world. They have their flocks. They have their means and ways of surviving, and pretty much the whole group is engaged in securing sustenance for themselves. Maybe toddlers don't really work, maybe really, really old people don't work, but everybody else pretty much participates. And then a change happens once people work out agriculture, and they realize that they can plant crops, and then stuff comes out of the ground, and they don't have to migrate anymore. And so now there's a real jump in productivity. And okay, I'll go back to and I read this in Carroll Quigley. I don't know where he got it from, but he got it from somewhere. So let's call this like an empirical fact, that before the Industrial Revolution, it took the labor of 21 persons, 21 people, and I assume that they were talking about grown-ups, working age population, to secure the sustenance of 23 people. So again, everybody has to work. Okay, so let's say we settle down, we work out agriculture, and we start becoming productive. So now there's a surplus. Once there's a surplus in a community, that means that not everybody has to work. So now there's excess labor that's available, meaning that if we wanted to build a bridge over to the next valley, we could allocate a squad of men to go and build that bridge, to figure it out how to do it and build. So while they're working on that bridge, they will not be hunting, they will not be raising crops. So now the community has to pay these men. They have to provide them their sustenance out of our surplus so that they can build that bridge. And so what do we have to do? We have to decide, well, okay, every family there needs to get so much flour and so much rice and so much oil and meat and eggs and milk, and so it's not a great leap from there to say that, okay, we need tokens to allocate this to these men. And so that's how you get money that's simply tokenized social surplus. And that surplus comes from the productivity of a community. And so let's say this squad of men, they build the bridge, and now we can go easily cross the river, and we can maybe plant crops in the next valley, or we can take our cows for pasture to the next valley. And now we get even more surplus, right? And so now we can think like, wow, okay, so now what we can do is maybe build a road over to the next valley where there's a different tribe, and maybe we can trade with them because they do these things well, we do these things well. And so again, the community has to make a decision to allocate some labor to that task. Okay, you people are going to go and build the road, but you're going to be paid for that out of the surplus of our community, and we're going to have to somehow keep track of that, and you're going to have to get some kind of a how do you call it, token with which you're going to claim your food, whatever you need, and then we build that road, and then we get even more productive. And so that's where you get economic growth. And the need for money emerges because you need a way to keep track of how you allocate this social surplus to productive uses. Okay, so there's a few things that are relevant to observe in this situation. One of them is that money should rightly represent the surplus, the economic surplus that a community actually produces. So the actual wealth of that community. B, the decision about how to allocate this wealth, these resources, is a political decision. Because we could say, hey, let's build the bridge to the next valley, or let's build a road to the other one, or let's build a fleet of fishing boats, or whatever. Or we can say, hey, let's figure out a way to dim the sun, or have a track and trace infrastructure in place, or let's build a big prison yard where we're going to put everybody we don't like. So it's a political decision. There's no avoiding that fact. And then you have to solve the problem of how are you going to make those political decisions. So there has to be some kind of a gathering of people. There has to be some kind of a village council. People have to cast their vote in some. So now you're getting a certain need for democracy, or really, really trusted, respected leaders. But of course, those leaders, if they make a sequence of really dumb decisions, or they say like, hey, I think the best idea we can do is let's go dim the sun, or let's go pay farmers not to produce food, like we have in the West today. Well, if they make a bunch of dumb decisions like that, then they're not going to be respected anymore, and somebody else will take charge. And then the third thing to observe there is that as the community's productivity grows, as the economy grows, then its wealth grows. So you're gonna need more of those tokens the more you foment this growth, right? The more you you say like, okay, let's go build a bridge, let's go build a road, let's go build a port, let's go build a fleet of fishing vessels, or whatever. So more and more labor gets absorbed in these infrastructure projects, and which means that you're going to have more and more tokens for them to be able to exchange them for this social surplus. So we see all of these elements. Now, here's where things went really, really wrong, is that, the bankers inserted themselves into this, and they say like, oh, well, why don't you all store these tokens with us? We're going to keep them safe for you. And then they realize that these tokens, like whether we're talking about gold or silver or, Bitcoin or little scraps of paper, doesn't matter. The bankers now, said, hey, we're going to keep this safe so nobody can steal them from you. And they realized that, people would keep their savings there. They wouldn't move them a lot. And they realized that a lot more savings just sat there than were in circulation. So they thought, maybe we can lend some of these savings out and earn some interest on that. And nobody will be the wiser for it. And so that's how, the whole banking business started. But the moment you introduce usury into that system, what happens is that now suddenly you're reducing the monetary mass in the system. Because let's say that the banker gives you 100, but they say you have to pay me 110. So when you repay your debt, 10 extra tokens goes to the banker, and 10 tokens fewer are in circulation. And so suddenly you have this conveyor belt where the means of exchange, these tokens, this money, is now being sucked out of the system systematically at large scale. And the banker's incentive is the more the better, because all of a sudden, there's all this money accruing to them simply for lending it out at interest. And so what happens is that suddenly the banker becomes very, very wealthy, while everybody else is gradually becoming poorer and poorer and poorer, until there's barely any purchasing power left in the real economy, in the real community. And at that point, the banker is like, okay, so now everybody's desperately poor here. Let me see. I'm gonna help you out. I'm gonna buy your land, or you can't pay your loan anymore. Well, okay, I'll take over your land and you're gonna work for me. Same difference. You're gonna be able to provide for your family, but I'll be the owner of your land. And so that's where the whole thing goes off the rails. And now, because the money becomes, like this community democratic aspect to the money and credit and circulation gets muddied up. Now the decision about how to allocate money and to whom goes away from the community and goes into the hands of the bankers. And now the banker may think like, okay, so I'm surrounded by all these desperately poor people. I'm desperately rich. I think what I need is a large police force. And I need really good kind of legislature that protects property rights, because this is all my property. I want it protected. So you start talking about property rights and all of these things. But everything starts to ossify around protecting the banker privilege. And so this has actually been with us since, at the very least, the Greek antiquity, where, the money lending elites have become the rulers of society. And then, to kind of conceal their role, they also very much like democracy, because they say like, okay, y'all can choose your leaders, but I still get to decide how capital is allocated because I'm sitting on all the money. Anyway, so this story can go on forever, but I think it really helps to gain clarity about what money and credit is or should be, is to go back to how money emerges and what purpose it serves to a to a community. And I think that everything that has built up around money and credit over the last 2,000, 3,000 years, a lot of it is really, deception. And, this is exactly why Alan Greenspan would say, hey, if you think you understand what I'm telling you, you're probably misunderstanding.
Which is very, sounds like a very arrogant statement to make, which I think says a lot about what he might be thinking about us, the general public. But I couldn't help but think, hear me out, about Karl Marx as you were doing your introduction of money, the way that it's an agreed upon unit, that it represents something physical. It has to, the tokens have to be backed by something. And I'm not talking about Karl Marx, the analyst who predicted particular, development of society towards communism. I'm talking about Karl Marx, who talked about the particular development of social relations, and the way that you're describing social relations that developed, even before the introduction of capitalism. If we think about capitalism as the economic system of liberalism. I know we talked about how difficult it is to define certain ideologies and economic systems, but that's how I would define it. And I think his analysis and his critique of social relations, these unequal social relations that you're describing, is still very much useful if we sort of separate that analysis from his predictions about the sort of eschatological development towards communism and a stateless society, et cetera, et cetera. I think that part of Marx is very useful. What do you think about it?
I tend to agree broadly, but I'm very careful with Marx because I haven't studied Marx in a very long time. We had, I grew up in the communist world. We had to study Marxism. I remember very vividly that we practically collectively rejected Marxism when we were in our, around the age of 16, 17. And I remember having lively debates with our professors, and poor people, they had to instill this ideology in us, but we were all like, no, that doesn't work at all. And so I think that Marx is useful. Marxism is valid in terms of class conflict,
Yes, exactly. That's what I'm referring
class
to.
Conflict is very much real, and I think that Marx got that part right, but I also think that Marxism was a bill of goods for the whole rest of us, because it didn't change anything, and in fact, one of the main things about the communist revolution in the Soviet Union, in the Bolshevik coup in 1917, was that Lenin's assignment was to have the whole system under one bank. So again, you're talking about the economy and you're talking about the class conflict, but you're never talking about the money, and you're deliberately keeping the subject of money out of the public debate, so people cannot clarify their ideas. And at the same time, these color revolutionaries, which is what basically the Bolshevik Revolution was, a color revolution. They went there with the assignment of we're going to have one bank, and everybody's going to be banking with that one bank, and that's what we got. And so the Soviet Union in 70 years went with one bank, which is basically what the banking elites still want for the Western world. When we talk about CBDCs, this is not like many banks issuing this money, and this is all supposed to be under one central bank. And every person, every firm would have an account only with a central bank. And then eventually this would be a single central bank for the whole world. So, it's exactly the same as what they tried to do with in Soviet Union, only maybe with a upgraded technology. Except it doesn't work, and it always fails, and it keeps failing, and it's failing now. But they somehow can't seem to figure it out, and they can't seem to give it up.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely issues with Bolsheviks initially. If you go back to that period of war communism, remember they got rid of money completely, so they had to rely on barter. So that was an absolute, pardon my French, shit show. I have a little bit of a different perspective on the Soviet Union, but it's sort of beyond the scope of this conversation. But I also think it's really interesting the way you introduced the topic of usury, because if you think about certain religions, traditional Christianity, Islam, that is forbidden. So for instance, sometimes I'm perusing Russian news and I would see that in the Muslim parts of Russia, for instance, in the Northern Caucasus, they're introducing banks that are not going to be using usury because that is against Islamic law. What do you think about, we're talking about ideology, but now we're talking about religion. What do you think about that particular feature of these religions where usury is forbidden?
I think it's absolutely important and valid, and I think that when usury began, which I don't know when it would be, it was in a community, let's say, where the economics of the community was clear to everybody. Like, we know what we do. We fish, we raise crops, we trade with these other groups and tribes around us, and we know what will make us wealthier and what will make us poorer. The role of usury, I think, didn't take much to understand. I think that people can work it out really quickly, and so this is why these religions already thousands of years ago understood that, like, you can't have usury. It's a toxin. It poisons all the relations in the society. It makes us poor. It makes us dependent. It makes us very vulnerable. So you cannot have usury. So I think the only way we got away from that is because all this complexity got woven into the system, and nobody understands what money is and what it serves and how it's meant to be used and allocated. But I think there's no way around it. We have to go back to money being, money has to represent the actual real wealth of a society, and there has to be no usury. And there's ways to get around it. It's not necessary. It's not necessary to lend money at interest. This is not at all the only way to allocate capital. And, if you go back to that, basic community, you realize that the community makes a political decision to allocate their wealth, the wealth that they have, for some productive use. And that's it. It's the wealth of the society being allocated to creating improvements for the future. And so there's absolutely no need to attach interest to any of that.
May I jump here just a second? There's I'm not a religious person. I don't have a religion. I'm not saying I'm not a faith person, but I'm not a religious person. I have a friend that is was from the Mormon Church. And he was explaining to me that back on the times, of John Smith or what's the name of the guy? I don't know.
Adam Smith.
Adam Smith, exactly.
Do you mean the Mormon leader, or do you mean Adam Smith, the economist?
The Mormon leader.
The Mormon
sorry.
leader. So then not Adam.
Sorry, not Adam. John.
It's Sam Smith. So basically, the Mormon Church, what they were doing was, lending money without interest to the faithful, and in the end, they are going to contribute with 10% a month anyway for the church. So basically, what they were doing, they were fomenting people to build their businesses, being that planting or having a shop or whatever. So these people would make more money, and that money would be 10% to the church because that's the church. We have similar things in the evangelical churches in Brazil. You have the dismal, what's called, which is basically 10% of your salary every month. The thing is that that's not different from the state. We pay taxes, right? So if a state simply lend money, and I'm not saying an abysmal amount of money, money that it doesn't have, lend money to people to build their business up, they're going to contribute with taxes anyway for the rest of their lives. So that sounds to me like an intelligent idea. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it sounds.
Which is basically what you just said.
It's a similar arrangement, so long as So the problem with usury is that the money lenders end up hoarding the money out of the economy. So it means that they absorb all the currency. Well, they absorb a very large amount of currency out of the situation. And so that means that they absorb the purchasing power out of the currency. So, however a community allocates capital, if it doesn't do that, if there isn't the hoarding element, then the money flows. People can, whatever they do, they can sell it to somebody because there's purchasing power in the community. So other community members can buy this from them. You pretty much know what you can sell, what people want, what they don't want. It's easy if people realize, hey, nobody's making shoes in this community and we need better shoes, then somebody will say like, hey, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna make shoes. And if people have money to spend, they're gonna say, hey, great, I really needed better shoes. So by just participating in a community, you understand what its needs are. You understand how you can improve its standard of living. And if it's the church that's allocating capital, so long as the church isn't hoarding it and with it concentrating political power in its hand, it's absolutely a productive arrangement. But another thing that is really an integral part of this whole equation that we haven't addressed is that as we talked about, it's the community that has to make decisions about how the wealth is going to be allocated. Well, then that means that we have to ask ourselves, what do we want? We're living here, we're here, we have a lifetime, and what do we want out of that? Do we want everybody to be employed? Do we want everybody to be busy, chopping down trees or building roads or, inventing vaccinations and how to dim the sun or whatever? Or do we want to enjoy life? Do we want to be happy? And what does that mean? Because maybe we want to create beauty. And so maybe if there's somebody in the community who says like, I want to spend my days painting, or I want to be writing, symphonies or sculpting marble. Well, maybe we want that. Who decides, And then, because, today we are really surrounding ourselves with a lot of ugliness. If you drive around, you see malls, you see these supermarkets, they're just like these ugly boxes with, and parking lots. And I mean, everything is kind of being crapified at an industrial scale. So, what if we want beautiful cities? What if we don't need all this growth? What if we want that every morsel of food that we put in our mouth be the best, the best strawberry that could possibly be grown, or the best tomato that could possibly be grown, or the best sip of wine. So there's quantity, there's quality, and we have to work out how those decisions are going to be made. And one thing that I think is very exciting about the internet era, is that we can actually democratize that. Because one thing that we've always had in the past is that wherever capital, wherever wealth is being allocated to this or that use, it's kind of centralized. It's allocated, like maybe it's the church leaders, or maybe it's the, like the village council, which, there's usually going to be somebody more charismatic than everybody else on that council, or it's going to be some banker or goldsmith. And so the decision making in some way is going to be centralized, or at least there's going to be a choke point where somebody's going to have undue influence. And I think that one thing that we can do today is we can democratize it in the sense that maybe we can spread that social surplus around. Say, like, this year we made, I don't know, $1 billion in extra wealth. And so everybody gets an extra $100 this year. And then, you can spend your $100 on whatever, or maybe you can invest it. And, with the crowdfunding platforms, I can decide where my $100 goes. I can go and I can see, like, oh, hey, that guy really has a talent for sculpting marble. I'm gonna invest $100 in his activity. So whatever, And so this can be done today, which I think in the past wouldn't have been possible, or it might have been possible in very, very small communities. But I think that these are all ideas that are worth exploring. I'm sure that a lot more good ideas can emerge, but I think it's very important for us to gain clarity about this mystery of money that we're dealing with, rather than, oh, Murray Rothbard says this, and Karl Marx says that, and John Maynard Keynes thinks this. And then, you turn on the TV and you'll have somebody talking about what Adam Smith said, and somebody else saying what Milton Friedman was saying, but nobody understands what the hell they're talking about. They're just talking ideology on top of one another. And then what usually happens is, I promise you, I've been called a communist by people when I share some of these ideas, because, people are listening to you and then they're like, hey, that sounds like a communist idea. Well,
that someone told him it's a communist idea.
Sorry, yeah. And I'm thinking, like, why do we forget about the labels and forget about the ideology and try to discuss ideas on their merit, as if you were designing a machine? Like, how do you have to put the cogs together so that you get the outcome that you desire, rather than the outcomes that you don't desire? Because one thing that we have in today's democracies, which are, like, insanely productive societies, we are insanely productive societies, and supposedly we decide policy, right, by electing our leaders. Well, what happens in reality is we're getting a whole lot of things that we hate, that we don't want, and we're getting very, very little of what we do want. So we're getting war, we're getting misery, we're getting censorship, we're getting repression. These things in huge abundance. You don't have to even do anything; it's just coming at you, right? And things that we do want: clean cities, safe streets, good schools, beautiful park areas for children, libraries, and all these things. That we can't have. There's never any money for that. You can't. If you're British, you can't even have money for heating your home during the winter.
Yeah, as long as you're not investing in the guy who wants to dim the sun, I think we'll be okay. Marvel is fine. The bespectacled guy who wants to dim the sun, maybe not. But I think I love the jabs, by the way, for those who are getting it. But I think it's not surprising that whenever you introduce these ideas, some people would say, you're a communist. Marcelo said exactly the right thing, that someone introduced that idea in their minds. I mean, there are plenty of examples. If you go back to 19th century Russian villages, I'm mentioning this because this is what I sort of specialized in. There's something that's today is described as distributism, where that surplus from the village would be distributed equally, including families that might not be doing so well, right? So they're sort of supporting the entire community, even though not everyone works equally in that community, and that decision is made by the village council. So obviously that predated, well, not just 19th century, I mean, we could go back farther, but that predated the ideology, or at least the theory of communism. But I'd like to go back to what you said. So it sounds like whatever went wrong, and if I understand you correctly, it's the lack of transparency about money, what it is. It's the accumulation of wealth and political power in particular individuals' hands, so that democratization is being removed. And also that disconnect between money and what it represents. So it sounds like what went wrong happened long ago. Usually people think about the 20th century and they would point out specific years. They would say it happened in 1913, it happened after 1945. So if what happened with money went wrong long ago, what happened in the 20th century? Did it go really wrong then? Is it just sort of a development, a step up from the way things were going wrong? If we talk about the USD as the global reserve currency, we don't know if it's going to remain such, but we know that when you're, something as easy example as constantly printing money, obviously it loses value. It's not really attached to what it's supposed to represent. So if you can sort of talk about the 20th century, is it a pivotal moment for you? Is it just a logical development from, the period that you talked about earlier, from 2000 years ago, Athens, for instance? How do you view that particular era?
Okay, so in 20th century, we had two world wars, right? We had the Bolshevik Revolution. We had the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union. A lot has gone wrong in the 20th century, but I think that how did this all happen? Where is it all coming from? I think that the people whom I would call empire builders, who were the network of power, who the vested interests behind the British Empire, I think that they got the idea that they can really go for total global domination. And so, we got World War I because they didn't want to allow Germany to emerge as a rival power. We got World War II because similarly, they wanted to use Germany in a similar way that they're using Ukraine today against Russia. I mean, the history as we are taught in school by the standard curriculum is stories for little children. It just isn't the way things actually happened. So I think that the 20th century maybe could be defined as the Western bankers' last hurrah at trying to gain global dominance. By World War I, the British Empire was already too weak to even maintain itself, let alone conquer the world. But what the people in the ruling establishment decided then is to infiltrate and co-opt the United States as a bigger, stronger power with a burgeoning economy, with much larger political and military power, and co-opt them and then use them as their it's kind of like a master blaster arrangement for people who remember Mad Max. The blaster being the big muscular giant, and the master being a little old decrepit dwarf sitting on his back and directing him, what to smash. And so this is the 20th century arrangement. To this day, we see this today. We see it's coming from London. It's Keir Starmer trying to lobby everybody into escalating the war against Russia that nobody wants. Nobody wants to go to war against Russia. But, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, is going to Washington trying to get the Biden administration to sign off on this. Thankfully for all of us, the Biden administration said no. Now they're going to the European capital, trying to get the French, the Germans, whoever, please, let's get World War III going. It's going to be awesome. That's exactly where World War I came from. That's exactly where World War II came from. And I think that this is the last hurrah, because the way this was being done, the way these policies were being managed covertly and through secret diplomacy and through secret service work, is now something that the leadership in Russia, the leadership in China, the leadership in Iran, and probably other places, now they understand. They understand the playbook. They're no longer falling into provocations, into the same little, hey, let's you and him fight kind of schemes. And not only that, but they understand where the aggression dynamic is coming from. They know that they're not fighting the Americans. They know that they're not fighting the Germans, the French. They know that they're fighting a system, a network of vested interests. And this network of vested interests is now painted itself into a corner, and the world that they can influence is now shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and they're growing more and more desperate. And if I can make a prediction, I think that they're not going to let them off the hook. The Russians are not going to let them off the hook. They're going to go after them until they are completely disenfranchised. And I also suspect, we're going off the subject a little bit, but I also suspect that the fact that the academics in India calculated the amount that the British plundered out of India during the colonial period, which is 44 trillion US dollars, they didn't do that to amuse themselves. I think they did that to have the receipts and to claim their gold back, or whatever, they might be able to claim back. And so obviously, if you're sitting in the city of London, you are absolutely in a panic. Your whole system that you thought you were going to rule the world with, that you're going to wield against everybody else, it's collapsing. And so I think that's the 20th century. I think that project is maybe what defined the 20th century. And 21st century, I think, is a collapse of this project.
Do you think the general public in the West understands it? So thinking about, maybe 40, 50 years ago, it took a certain number of years to pay off a mortgage, right? That's based on credit. These days, it takes much, much longer. And I think people probably perceive it on the basis of things that impact them directly, right? Inflation at the grocery store, how much their house, their mortgages, et cetera. Do you think there's any kind of an understanding of what's going on globally to the general public beyond that immediate perception of their basically daily life?
I think there's relatively little understanding, but there's a great thirst for understanding it. And your podcast is a perfect example. We're discussing these things, and people are really trying to work it out, because they see that stuff doesn't make sense. How come it's so hard to put the food on the table and pay the rent today, whereas maybe 20, 30 years ago it was a lot easier? And 50, 60 years ago, it was one blue collar job that could maintain a whole family in comfort. So obviously, something's gone wrong and people are realizing it. And I think that the more this collapse is accelerating, the more people are understanding that it all kinds of ties into the same thing. The war in Ukraine is not separate from the COVID pandemic. It's not separate from the war in Israel. It's not separate from the conflict with China. It's not separate from the colonialism in Africa, and so forth. And so people are asking themselves questions and they're seeking answer. And so while there's relatively little understanding today about it, it's growing. And I think that the percentage of people who have at least vague notions about what we're dealing with is probably hugely, I would say probably 10,000-fold what it might have been 30 years ago. Because once upon a time you had people like, I don't know, Ezra Pound or Eustace Mullins who worked it out, but they were regarded as conspiracy kooks, and Eustace Mullins ended up in a nut house. He was put there. Well, you can do that when 0.001% of the population is understanding things. And you can say like, oh, this guy's mentally not okay. We're going to help him and we're going to put him in a mental institution. But like once it's maybe 5% of the population or 10% of the population or, some, then you cannot put everybody in prison or in a mental institution. So I think that is a completely different equation now, something that has never happened in history before, probably because we never had the internet. And the internet is kind of, like if you regarded humanity as a superorganism, this is the first time we evolved the nervous system. And, the information can travel from any point to any point. What the effect of this will be, nobody can predict, but I'm very optimistic. I think that for sure it's leading to good places. I know it's helping me an awful lot because I have access to so many people who are putting out phenomenal research materials online, and it enables you to learn and understand. And then it also enables you to share what you learned and understood with other people, and then they absorb it and then they share it. And so, a long time ago, Isaac Newton said that, if he could see farther, it was because he could stand on the shoulders of giants. And I think today, not only are we standing on the shoulders of giants, I think we're constantly climbing on top of one another, and we're going. It's become like almost like an organic growth. It's like a vine that's growing unstoppably, and it's going places. I don't know where, but I think it's going to good places. I think that maybe we're going to see some kind of an emancipation of humanity. And I think that the only way that we can fail at this is if we give up, if we surrender and acquiesce to whatever monstrous agenda these moneylender elites have for us. Elites, I hate to use that word. Money-lending parasites have for us.
Oh, I don't know if YouTube will like that. But yeah, I mean, obviously this is why there's such a collective freak out about internet censorship in, the European government these days, because they don't really know how to control the information that's coming from so many diverse sources. And it's not coming from a single managed narrative, right? They can censor certain media coming from other countries, but it's much more difficult to censor people, individuals, right, who are sharing information. So I think that's pretty obvious. But What I'd like to know is whether you think, again, you can put on your tinfoil hat on, whether the powers that be understood, let's say like something like anti-Russian sanctions would actually end up undermining the power of the US dollar by, freezing Russian assets abroad, something like that. Or, there's the other side of the coin where some people would argue that this is a controlled demolition, that they're aware that these sanctions would backfire. What is your opinion about that?
You mean the sanctions, Western sanctions against Russia?
Yes.
Oh no,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that they were. I think they were fully convinced that they were going to crush Russia.
Okay, so it's not a sort of 5D chess of we're engaging in controlled demolition and we're moving somewhere else. It's actually a conviction, perhaps buying your own bullshit kind of conviction that they would work. So, just something as obvious as freezing Russian assets would undermine, the faith in the US dollar. That's what I was referring to. Plus, of course, all the other effects of them.
Yeah, I think that they're being led forward by desperation because, the nuclear sanctions imposed against Russia in 2022, they were all, like this is going to, collapse the Russian economy. And then, the Russians are going to, topple Vladimir Putin's regime, and we're going to take over. We're going to get some, Boris Yeltsin back into Kremlin, and then they're going to do everything we tell them to, and we're going to take over Russian resources, and we're going to turn Russians into our, cheap source of labor. But it didn't work out that way. And, like the fact that they were serious is you could read the statements of people like Tony Blair and others. They were fully convinced that this is how it was going to play out. And then the fact that it didn't play out really caught them by surprise. And so, there was a question, why did the Russians leave $300 billion of their assets with Western central banks? I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. I think that first of all, that doesn't matter so much. If you're okay, if you can pay your bills, whether you have $10,000 in the bank in some savings account, or you have $1 million in the bank in some saving account, if you don't have immediate need for that money, it doesn't really matter whether it's sitting there, not sitting there, whether it's frozen, not frozen, whatever. You have other stuff on your agenda and you're doing other things. Now, if Russia was desperate for, food imports or for steel imports or for crude oil or something, and they needed those $300 million to procure all those imports, well, then that would change things very dramatically. But as we know, Russia is self-sufficient. So they don't need desperately imports from other nations. And so the fact that money is sitting somewhere, it's not a debilitating problem. And then, as Otto von Bismarck said, when you deal with Russians, you have to deal straight because they will come for their due. They will not forget. So I think as far as the Russians are concerned, that's their $300 billion. In the current environment, they can't get it back. But, there's going to be other administrations and other governments, and they will have to deal with the Russians. And then the Russians will say, about those $300 billion, back when you froze it, it was worth this much gold, this much of whatever. And so anything we discuss, you're going to have to reimburse us for that. And so that will happen, that wealth will not be, nobody will get off the hook free stealing that wealth. That's not going to happen.
But do you think for someone like Tony Blair, whom you quoted, do you think that was an ideological conviction that we're going to introduce these measures and they're going to work? Obviously they have a whole slew of experts. Is it the fact that experts are also buying their own bullshit and kind of operating within very typical parameters rather than going outside the box a little bit like you? It's just kind of remarkable because it seems like so many people in the alternative media, alternative analysts, right, predicted something like this. But the mainstream ones that are advising governments did not foresee it.
My strong impression is that there's a kind of idea about superiority in the West. There's a certain, disregard for the Russians and for other people. The people in the West really think that they're cleverer than others. And when the war in Ukraine started in 2020, I know a lot of Brits. I worked in London and so forth, and many of these guys, and they're well-educated people, and their opinions are in general better and more nuanced than the average population. But they had this. For no reason, they had this faith that people who lead the West are really clever. That, like, just you wait, some kind of a curveball is coming out of this mess and you'll see, and it's going to devastate Russia. And, they also, I also heard opinions how the Russians are not capable of thinking strategically. Like they just react like these primitive brutes, troglodytes, and they just react to the stimulus, but they can't really think in terms of, cunning, clever strategy. So they always fall for stupid things. And you can see that, in, for example, very recently you had Victoria Nuland, who explained why the peace negotiations between the Russians, between the Russians and Ukrainians failed in April 2022. And then she said, like, well, as they were getting closer to signing those documents, Ukrainians were increasingly asking us for advice. Like, these Ukrainians just didn't know what to do. So they were like, well, what do you think? Should we sign this? And then it became clear to us, it became clear to the Brits that Vladimir Putin put his really relevant provisions in the small print somewhere in the back of the agreement. As though the Ukrainians can't read for themselves. Like it really took Victoria Nuland and Boris Johnson to realize the Russians' clever ruse, like, you thought you were going to sign this peace, but no, we figured you out. And the fact that Victoria Nuland is even giving this explanation today really reflects that she's coming from a place of superiority. Because here you had these primitives negotiating between themselves, screwing one another. And then they asked us, and then we told them, like, well, you see this, there's this trick up the Russian sleeve, and so don't you sign it. And you see that all the time in the attitudes of Westerners, all the time. And I remember this attitude from the 1990s, like when Croatia and Serbia and Slovenia and Bosnia all went into this wars of succession when former Yugoslavia fell apart. And we had all these, Carl Bildt and Robert Owen and Cyrus Vance and all these Western emissaries coming to advise us. And they really did treat us as these primitive barbarian brutes. And here came these Westerners who knew things, and they marveled at our simplicity, but they were there to advise us and to guide us. Well, things aren't like that. Things really aren't like that. But I think it's really coming from this place of superiority and some form of subtle racism, actually.
I don't think it's so subtle, actually.
Yeah, I was about to say that.
but I would say it's in maybe the past few hundred years. I think it's embedded in the ideology of liberalism, and we see it in the fact that it's perceived to be universal. We're going to export it to other places and apply it to other cultures where it may not be applicable at all. I think that very idea that you can just engage in state building after you had your fun little war in Iraq or something like that, and apply your own principles, your own culture through the prism of, structuring it through the liberal ideology. implies that you think that your ideology is superior, your way of life is superior, where you don't even have to say it, that these are, primitive barbarians, as you would have said 500 years ago. It's implied in that very exportation of this ideology and, all the nice, lovely words about democracy, free speech, et cetera, that we've been, hearing for decades. It's implied within that.
Yeah, but it's actually worse, because it's not only that they think that our system is superior. They actually think that they as individuals are superior to these other individuals, because, like, we come from this shining city on the hill, whereas these primitives are, leading these lives that are probably, but for our benevolent influence, would be nasty, brutish, and short. To quote, who am I quoting? Locke? No, that's not John Locke. That's Thomas Malthus, I think. No, who said that, like,
It almost sounds like Leviathan, but I'm not sure if that's where the quote would be coming from. I'm almost thinking it's like, like 16th century language, but maybe it's Malthus.
Yes. So they were saying, because the British Empire back in the day, they were colonizing the world and plundering, but they needed an ideological cover, and back then, freedom and democracy were not in
not
vogue.
Yet, not yet in vogue.
But civilizing the savages was in vogue, and so they were saying, like, well, if it wasn't for us, then their lives would be nasty, brutish, and short.
This is probably why they're so shocked by the rise of China in the last 20 years, because the assumption was that these people are only good for manufacturing our products cheaply. And now that China is surpassing them left and right in every possible domain, I think that's one of the reasons there's such a shock. It's not just the fact that there's such fierce competition. It's the fact that they were not expecting it from people who are supposed to be subservient to, the powers that be.
I mean, just jumping here very quickly, and this is in every aspect. When we discuss, for example, when we see a lot of Western analysts discussing, the smart ones, the good ones, there's always this concept when they treat that everything is going wrong because the West did everything wrong. Well, other people outsmarted the plan. That's the deal. That's the real deal. They did everything wrong. Yeah, well, not everything. Other people outsmarted them. And this is symptomatic, exactly, because it almost sounds to me like we are so awesome that we are the best even when we're being stupid.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. That is the case. Yeah, that is the case. And I also wanted to add, Nina, because you mentioned the Chinese, and it's absolutely there. Like, if you read Halford Mackinder, and back 100 years ago, he was writing all these papers about the heartland and the pivot area of the world, and which global power might emerge to, let's say, become a serious rival to the British Empire. One of these countries that he identified was China. But he said China might become a rival, but only if they're managed and guided by the Japanese. So Halford Mackinder thought, like, China is kind of there and there's a lot of Chinese, but they're harmless unless the Japanese kind of tell them, like, do this, and
and then on top of that, you have the Americans coming in, as the official occupation force to Japan in 1945 and treating the Japanese like they're, below them, and they're going to be unable to democratize and write their own constitutions. So we're better write their constitution for them. So it's interesting that you have these layers of the Chinese will be under the Japanese and the Japanese will be under us. So it's definitely there. But Alex, let's go back to the question of the informed public, the reason why we're doing the second episode. So I'm going to read first some of the questions/comments from the previous stream, and I apologize if I am mispronouncing people's names. So this one is coming from Luis Nunez. He says, quote, bring Alex back, please, and ask him if he thinks a two-tier monetary system with an elastic currency for general use that is allowed to float and to grow as needed, coupled with a more rare hard money based on precious metals, mostly for a store of value and occasional large transactions, seems viable. I know it's a long statement, a little bit awkward grammatically.
Who asked this question?
I think it's Luis Nunez. I'm not sure if I mispronounced it.
I want to give my hats off to Luis Nunez, because this is exactly on the track of solving our money problems and giving resilience to local communities. And this is actually something that very, very, very similar to what I've been advocating in these discussions for probably the last 10 years. Yeah, this is exactly what is needed, because then, you can have, this is in fact what we have had in the Middle Ages in Europe. And this is very similar to what you were describing with the Russian villages, because you can have that local community that kind of lubricates local trade and exchange. But then you also have maybe, the sovereign's legal tender with which you exchange with other communities or pay taxes and things like this. But if the money disappears at the national level, well, the local community can still trade. The baker doesn't have to go out of business because suddenly the US dollar is gone and there isn't enough of it, and so forth. So that's exactly what on track of what we actually need.
I'm muted as well. You're muted and
Sorry,
I was muted.
I apologize. So this would solve the problem of limited supply. That was the question that, remember, we talked about in the previous stream.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
At the local level, where I think it's extremely important, because, I think that we have to organize our societies so that they're consistent with the natural world. We are part of the natural world. And in the natural world, intelligence agency always comes bottom up. So those decisions about how to allocate wealth, how to allocate the social surplus, the capital that we have at our disposal, it has to be made locally, because then it's going to be made in an intelligent way, and it's not going to be wasted. Nobody is going to come up with the idea, hey, let's dim the sun, or let's cover all our productive fields with solar panels. Nobody's going to make that stupid decision.
Perfect. Let's jump into the next one. So this was written by Thomas Jensen. And again, I think for a lot of the comments here, the English is not the first language. So that's why the phrasing might sound a little bit awkward to native English speakers. Quote, dear Nina and Alex and Marcelo, thank you for the program. Alex is very excellent. We agree. But the gold, Bitcoin, and future trading unit deserves more time for Alex. What I heard is his explanation of the problem of limited money supply, as with Bitcoin and with gold, but he did not really explain what is the future unit of trade when not gold and not Bitcoin. Just some more words. Alex is immensely interesting. Please organize more time with him. So, end quote. So you sort of answered this, but can you elaborate a little bit further by targeting this question?
Yes, of course. So I think that I think that Bitcoin as technology, how do you call it, blockchain is phenomenally important technology, and I think that it will certainly have an immensely important role in the development of human society. But the problem I have with Bitcoin today is that it's mainly being used as an object of speculation. So people trade Bitcoin in order to make capital gains, to make money, and I think that probably 99% of all transactions are done for this reason. It's still not. I think this is changing, but very slowly. That you can go to a shop and buy stuff and pay with Bitcoin, or go to a cafe and have a lunch and pay with Bitcoin. But we're a long way away from that. And then of course the fact that there's a limited supply of Bitcoin means that Bitcoin cannot keep up with the economic growth. It cannot be the means of it cannot be the proper means of exchange, and it cannot be the currency in which we denominate capital for economic growth, like the capital that we allocate to productive uses. So what that should be, I don't know, and I don't think it's even so important. People, it can be anything tokenized. So it has to be tokenized. And if you how do you call it, tokenize Bitcoin in a certain way, like you create a different layer so that maybe the value of Bitcoin remains fixed, but maybe the tokens that are related, let's say we pretend that this Bitcoin represents our social surplus, then you can maybe build a layer of tokens based on the Bitcoin, which maybe then can grow, and there can be a certain monetary inflation that keeps up with the economic growth in the community. So, and that's also, gold has the very same problem, because in order for you to have more and more gold to fund economic development and raising the standards of living of the community, you have to mine more gold, and it has to come into circulation. And the problem I have with this is, these are vague ideas, but to me, we're part of life on this planet, and life depends on all these minerals being dispersed in the biosphere in a certain way that they're accessible to us, that they're bioavailable to us. Well, if we mine everything out of the ground and refine it, so like if you turn the whole earth into a block of copper and a block of gold and a block of silver and a block of calcium, well, that doesn't support life anymore. So I think that the idea of mining metal out of the ground, no matter how beautiful it is, mining it out of the ground in order to store it underground somewhere, it just doesn't make sense to me. We need, like what's sustaining us actually is our own productivity, with which we take from what is freely given to us in this world as our birthright, the abundance that exists on this earth, and we convert it into something that's useful for us. We take the cow and turn it into steak, right? I'm sorry, people who are vegetarians don't like to hear that, or we take a potato out of the ground and we turn it into mashed potatoes, and then we eat them, right? This is what sustains us, and this is what's satisfying, like a beautiful meal that then we share with other people. All of this makes part of the magic of life. Taking gold out of the ground in order to put it in a safe somewhere and guard it there and feel anxious and fearful about what's going to happen to it, I don't think that's the answer. And I think that in some way we're even subtly undermining ourselves with that. But we didn't find a better answer, so maybe that's the next stage.
So where else do you see the usage of the blockchain technologies, just out of curiosity? It's not a topic that I really follow much, so I would love to hear it.
Well, I think that blockchain can exactly replace money. It can become money in the full sense of the word, but it like the 21st century's version. Money that you can, like I can pay you right now $1 or 10 cents, and you will receive $1 or 10 cents. No banking fees deducted, nothing, instantly. And maybe I can pay you that because you'll teach me how to speak Russian, or Marcelo can teach me how to put together a podcast. We can exchange very quickly, flawlessly, in a very flexible way. We can it can be used for buying and selling things, and so it's bringing us together, skills and talents that maybe cannot find fertile ground to grow on with just paper money, can maybe find fertile ground if the means of exchange are as flexible and as quick and effective as crypto blockchain makes it possible. So I think it has tremendous potential. It'll just take political willpower to make it happen, because again, we can't get away from the states, because the states can destroy it. So they have to say it's okay, you can use these currencies. they have to go along with us. That's what I mean to say. I'm not saying that we need their permission. We need them to not be the agent of sabotage on behalf of the banking cartel. And then, it has to be accepted as a means of exchange, right? So that they don't punish people because they use, nowadays, if let's say if you and I, Nina, made a contract for exchange of whatever, and we specify this will be so many silver eagle coins, we could end up in prison. So there has to be, like the exchange has to be freed up.
So back to the power of the state and the concentration of power over our lives. Okay, let's get into another question. Again, I think it sort of gets at what you already answered, but I think maybe from a slightly different angle. And it's a pretty long question, so bear with me. This is APF Lewis, if I wrote this down correctly. This person is quoting you, quote, "In effect, the government has to ensure that the quantity of money in circulation always grows to support economic growth," end quote. So this was your quote. And this person is responding to you. Always interesting to listen to Alex, but I disagree on this quote. Government does not need to support economic growth by increasing the supply of money. If the currency is stable in value, that by itself fosters economic growth. Then, as the economy grows, again, to maintain currency stability, the government can increase the currency in circulation. In my opinion, Alex puts the cart before the horse. It is currency stability that promotes economic activity, but economic activity requires some increase in the money supply. And yes, Bitcoin cannot do that. The flip side is, of course, when the economy contracts, the government should actually reduce the money supply to maintain currency value stability. In the West, over the last 60 years, governments have used every economic crisis to introduce more money supply into the economy, so-called quantitative easing, that suits the banks because that money always goes to the banks. So, end quote. This is a long one, but I think you'll have a good response to it.
Yes and no. I don't disagree with the fact that the value of money should be stable. That's essential. You have to be able, if you go into any kind of business, you need to know that, what you sell, you'll get the money that you get back for it, you're going to be able to use it for other things. So, it already goes into the business plan, the whole concept that what you're going to be buying and selling, and you're doing it for a reason, right? To pay yourself and to grow your own wealth. That's all legit. But when it comes to large things, where the whole society is impacted, things like building high-speed rail network, building large canals like the Erie Canal in the United States, that's not going to be small businesses who are going to be doing those projects. That is going to be a government, whether we like it or not. Government has become kind of a dirty word in the West, where everything is like, oh, free individuals, blah, blah, blah. But, there's a role for the collective. And, people have allow themselves to be convinced that everything the government touches is inevitably going to be crap, and the government's going to bungle everything. Well, go see how the Swiss railroads work, or how the Japanese railroads work. They work phenomenally well. They're super efficient. Now, you can say that they're not profitable, because they're not. And Swiss railroads are, they're losing money. The postal services, things like this. But they're not there to be profitable enterprise. Not everything has to be profitable enterprise. They're there to lower the cost of transactions, to make it easier for everybody else to trade. So, for example, when they built the Erie Canal in the United States, that was a massive collective project that, had to be government sponsored or directed or credited, whatever. It lowered the cost of exchange, of trade, between the east coast of the United States and the Great Lakes by 90%. So like whether the canal, whoever built the canal operator, whoever maintains the canal, whether that exact entity is profitable or not, shouldn't be the deciding factor of whether the canal gets built or not. And so, there is a role for the government, and I strongly feel that role should be democratic in the sense that the decisions have to correspond with the people's aspirations, right? So nobody's asking for dimming the sun. Nobody's asking for track and trace system. Nobody's asking for vaccine passports and CBDCs and, whatever else they want us, 15-minute cities. But people are asking for other things. And so people should be allowed to give their voice and to make those decisions. And then we would have a better world, because people would say, like, we want clean streets. We want safe cities. We want good education. We want delicious food in large abundance, right? We want to drink good drinks. We want, things that make life better. We want to give young people money to go and write novels and plays and make sculptures and paint beautiful paintings and maybe build cathedrals. That's what matters, right? And that can only come from the people. It's obviously not coming from the banking cartel, which may be irrelevant, but it seems to me that they really are kind of very, very ungodly bunch that kind of gets some kind of a perverted pleasure out of doing things exactly contrary to the genuine human nature.
Marcelo, did you want to jump in before I do?
I kind of lost myself. Beautiful words. What I was going to say, education and health things. That's my concept of most of the things that are wrong is basically that the average human being does not have the basics. And I'm not saying, a Ferrari or a fancy car, but the basics, decent education, decent health, free. Because I think it's important, you mentioned that the Swiss railroads, also the Italian rails are mostly public, state-owned Trenitalia, or, all those things that are state-owned. In the mind of the investors, and I have a lot of friends that are investors, they see things as they have to give money. I give an example, the Petrobras, the Brazilian oil company, the huge oil company. Yes, it has to give money. It's an oil company. If you're not making money being an oil company, you're doing something very wrong. But at the same time, the most important part is the energy for the country, is the sustainability for the country, is the strategic importance of the company for the country. And people miss this part, where the energy, the fuel, that is the point of such company to exist, not make money to bankers.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that, because certain things are there to serve everybody. They make part of the social infrastructure. Things like energy grid, the postal service, railroads, roads, ports, airports, trash disposal, and then you can go farther. The actually credit in circulation, that should be a public utility, a part of social infrastructure. The internet, all of these things that serve everyone should be available to everyone, and they should be available regardless of whether any particular entity involved in this is profitable or not. There's a case in Argentina, for example, when the president. What was the guy's name?
Millet?
No. The former Millet, the 1980s Millet.
I don't think there was ever a former Millet, but okay, I got the point. I don't remember the.
Anyway, he was all on the neoliberal side, and he was promising people, "I will not betray you, I will not betray you." And then once they elected him president, he privatized everything. He privatized Argentina.
He betrayed them.
Yes, of course. He privatized Argentinian railroads. And so the country went from a network of about 15,000 kilometers to, I think, something like 6,000 kilometers. So whole swathes of Argentina lost rail service because those lines were unprofitable. And so they only, the private investors only chose to keep the parts that were profitable for them. And as a result, the economy of all these other parts of Argentina where they lost the rail service collapsed. So, for this one company that runs the railroads or a group of companies, so that their investment could be profitable, you let the whole economy take a massive hit. So it doesn't, I do question, what's the place of the cart and what's the place for the horse. And, maybe we shouldn't even think about it as a cart and a horse, like something necessarily. But, for every different thing, there has to be a good reason. If you will reform society, you have to think about what are its parts and what you want to achieve. And then if what you're doing is achieving the desired objective, then you're doing things right. If it's doing the opposite, then something is wrong. And forget the ideology. It has to be profitable. Says who? You're not going to let half of your country's economy collapse just so that you could say, like, oh, look, we have this profitable railroad company here.
Not only says who, but profitable to whom? Because
exactly.
If it's not profitable for me, well, it's my money, right? Tax money or anything I'm producing. If it's not profitable for me, then to whom?
Yes, exactly. And what I remember from the former Yugoslavia, which was a socialist country, right, with a one-party communist system, we had a postal service, which was a state monopoly. I think it was not profitable, but it was incredibly efficient. You can think of UPS and FedEx on its best day. And that's what it was. You could get a parcel or a letter from any small town in former Yugoslavia to any small town pretty much within 24 hours. It was just insane. Of course, it cost a song. It cost nothing. You could bring them any kind of a parcel, practically. When I was in the military, and this was already Croatia, but we inherited this system, so it was still working well. We had friends whose parents had a vineyard, so they would send us like one of those plastic canisters of wine, 20 liters, and they would just bring the canister to the post office, write the address on a marker on the white plastic, and it arrived to us the next day. And we were stationed on an island which only had one ferry connection a day, and this arrived overnight from some little village on the other side of the country. And the cost was negligible. And then they had all these services that were available. For example, if you wanted to be an entrepreneur and sell your wares by catalog, then if I ordered something from some catalog, then the person would just bring the parcel to the post office. The postman would bring you the parcel, and you would pay the postman for the parcel. So let's say I ordered a T-shirt from somebody. T-shirt cost $10. I give the $10 to the post office, to the postman. So the postman was the cashier for this catalog business that anybody could develop using. It worked really well. Anyway, like we copy pasted Western, free democratic, privatized everything. They introduced DHL and UPS and private courier services in it. Now it's a complete disaster. Nothing works. You could have a letter going from one end of the city to the other end of the city and take three weeks. And the cases of parcels arriving empty, like they become very bossy about what the package has to look like, and you have to buy a box from them. Like if it isn't in the box that's just right, then they're not even going to deliver. And the paperwork, when you put an address on it, you get like 5 sheets of copied forms. And so, like the services become crap. It costs a lot more, like many-fold more expensive, and it doesn't work. So, what I'm saying is we shouldn't base our decision on ideology of what Murray Rothbard says, or what Adam Smith said, or whether it's private or public, or whether it's state or individual, or whether it's profitable or it's not profitable. We have to really base our decisions on what we want to achieve, and then we have to see how we're going to arrange these social and state bodies to achieve those ends. And if what we put together achieves those ends feasibly and efficiently, then we're doing the right thing. Whether somebody's going to call it socialist or communist, we should just simply forget that. It kind of muddles the thinking.
I think the question of culture, I'm sorry, Marcelo, the question of culture that you keep coming back to, the question of beauty, also stems partially from this idea of profitability, that we kind of have this onset of ugliness, the box malls, the concrete, the lack of trees, the decline of cultural production in general, because it's more difficult to sell this under the banner of profitability and to explain that we need this for the soul, right? We need beautiful cities because they're nicer to live in. Art is nice to look at. It makes us feel, it makes us, come in contact with something that is higher with us. And when you start looking at profitability, some of these projects may not be profitable, right? And I think that's not the entire question, but that's one of the reasons for this onset of ugliness. And we keep coming back to the question of culture very tangentially. I think it would be great to do a full episode on that. So perhaps we can have Alex and another expert to discuss it at some point in the future.
Yeah, so I have to run to another show in about 15 minutes.
Do you have anything on the chat? I was going to ask you. I see there is a lot, but it's mostly statements. And as they're being answered, I think a lot of them have been answered.
Exactly.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So no, there was a couple of questions in the beginning that it vanished from the chat. I'll have to look it after and perhaps address Alex in another opportunity. Nina, do you have any other questions to Alex?
Well, I had a brief question, but I think he also sort of answered it. This was on Telegram. I was asking about Jeffrey Sachs, I guess, coming to Russia, remember, as one of the Clintonite experts in the 90s and promoting USD as opposed to, sell money for Russia. And of course, these days, he is known for much different type of advice, right? So I think that's what the question was about. But I think you pretty much answered it. Correct me if I'm wrong.
We didn't really touch on Jeffrey Sachs, but as it happens, Jeffrey Sachs was the object of really close research I've done for my book, Grand Deception, right? Because he was very deeply involved in the Russia's transition from, communism to capitalism. And I thought for the longest time that he played a very, very negative role in that episode. But then when I looked much, much closer into it, he really tried to do the right things. And he was sabotaged by people at the IMF and the World Bank and Harvard International Institute for Development, whatever that thing is called. He was actually giving good advice. He was advocating for forgiveness of debt to Russia. He was also, because when the Soviet Union fell apart, they kept the ruble for another year, which was now a common currency for Russia and Ukraine and Kazakhstan and all of these former Soviet republics. And he was saying that doesn't make any sense, because now everybody has incentive to print and dump inflation on the others, and that's actually what happened. So he was saying immediately after this happens, each country has to have their own currency, and he was overruled. And then it was a question of providing Russia something like $15 billion a year to finance the transition from communism to capitalism. And he was overruled on that, and so on and so forth. I think eventually he resigned. But I think that one thing he didn't realize is that it wasn't that people who were running the show were wrong and had bad ideas. I think that what he wasn't prepared for, that people who were running the show actually wanted to hurt Russia as badly as they possibly could, and they were doing all these things deliberately. This is why they were rejecting all of his advice and all of his arguments. And I think that he thought that if he explained things, that they would see the light, and then they would say like, okay, yes, we have to forgive Russia's debt. We have to provide them with funding for the transition and this and that. So I think that this is why it took him a long time to realize that he shouldn't even be in that business.
That's amazing, because usually the typical coverage, like the famous articles, the Harvard Boys Do Russia, remember, from the late 90s, kind of puts them at the center of that. And I wasn't aware of some of these minute details that definitely present them in a more positive way. But thank you so much for the explanation. And I know everyone has to run. Thank you guys for tuning into the Winter Latina Show. Any parting words, guys?
I would just part with saying that I think that we are on the right path, that we are winning against the oligarchy and the oppression, and that we just need to carry on, put one foot in front of the other, and we have a very good chance of winning a better future for future generations. So
a note of optimism. Usually we end on a note of pessimism. Thank you for that. Go ahead, Marcelo.
No, I'm an incurable optimist, but I actually think I'm right about this. This is not, this is not just optimism for the optimism's sake. It just reflects what I'm observing in the world.
So a realist then.
Lucas Leroy's, you met him in the Super Live. He used a better expression. He's a hopeful pessimist.
Hopeful pessimist.
I'm actually out and out flaming optimist.
Good. So thank you guys. Thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you for coming back, Alex, on such short notice.
Thank you for having me, and all the best until the next time.
See you the next time, and everybody remember to like, share, subscribe, and all the links on the description for my channel,
including Alex.
For Nina's, for Alex's channel, and all the links possible are on the description. And see you guys next time.
See you soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.